Hello! In this module we're going to discuss the dialogue Euthyphro, written by Plato about Socrates. So for the middle chunk of our course we're going to be focused on these three Greek philosophers, the philosopher Socrates, his student Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. Socrates was born in around 470 BCE, so before the Common Era starting around the time of Jesus. So that's around almost 2,500 years ago, and Aristotle dies in BCE 322, so that's the space of almost 100 years from when Socrates is born to when Aristotle dies. And these are statues of all of them. Actually, they're mostly Roman later recreations of Greek statues. And they all look white, and that's sort of unfortunate because in Greek statuary, it turns out that while there are all these images of these white marble statues, that's actually not the way they were at the time that they were created and displayed. They were actually painted much like this, and archaeologists and other researchers have been able to go back and find traces of paint on them, and these are attempts at recreating what they might have looked like. And so it's unfortunate that these statues are all these sort of washed out white, and this relates to the fact that we're also studying what we might think of as a bunch of dead white men. The idea of what is white as a race is contested. It changes a lot, doesn't have a biological reality, and in a lot of times, actually, the people who create this label white would actually not have thought of Greeks as white. So I'd encourage us to think flexibly about these philosophers. So they are all from Greece, and Socrates and Plato both spent basically almost all their lives in Athens. Aristotle was from northern Greece and spent a lot of time in Athens, but didn't just live there. So Athens was, in some sense, a democracy. There were about 250 to 300,000 people in Athens at the time we're talking about, which is in the 400s and 300s BCE. I said it was a democracy. Well, it was sort of a democracy. So, first of all, only men could participate in the democracy, women couldn't. And then, like virtually all the societies on the Mediterranean at that time, it was a slave society, and so of course slaves would not have been allowed to vote, and not everyone who lived in Athens was a citizen. If you were from outside Athens, you weren't necessarily a citizen. So in fact, only 30 to 50,000 people actually participated in the democracy. So do we want to call that a democracy? Well, kind of yes, kind of no. On the one hand, it's a profoundly oppressive society, excluding women from political power and otherwise being very patriarchal, and it's a slave society, very bad in that respect. On the other hand, compared to other little cities in the area, they're not democratic at all. They may be ruled by a king. So how do we want to think of that? Well, it's a mixed bag, and in some ways it's a very bad bag, and in other ways it's not as bad. So we need a little bit of, and this is a painting of the central part of Athens that's called the Acropolis, and on that hill, and then or the top of the hill is called the Acropolis, and there are different buildings up there. The most prominent one is called the Parthenon. There's a big statue of the goddess Athena. Down below is what we might think of as the Agora. It's a sort of open marketplace, sort of. This is a painting by German painter from the 1800s, so not probably fairly accurate, but also pretty speculative as well. So what we need to know about Athens, besides the fact that it's in some sense a democracy and in some sense really oppressive city, is that in the 400s, so during Socrates' lifetime, Athens has been at war. First, it was allied with lots of other Greek city-states fighting against Persia. So if you've heard about the battles of Marathon or Thermopylae in the movie 300, the movie 300 is a very fictionalized version of parts of that battle. I would encourage you to not buy into the representation of the Persians in that movie, but that is set in that time period. After the Greeks defended themselves from the Persian invasion, they turned to fighting with each other, and Greece was defeated by another Greek city-state called Sparta in what were called the Peloponnesian Wars. Sparta didn't control Athens, but it did install some leaders, and there was lots of political upheaval, and we're going to see that that's somewhat relevant to what's going on in these dialogues. So that's a little bit more of the historical background. So we have these two philosophers, Socrates and Plato. If you look in our text, you'll see that this dialogue Euthyphro is not under Socrates, it's under Plato, and in fact you'll see that there is no entry for Socrates at all. So what's up with that, if Socrates is philosopher? Well, Socrates was a son of a stonemason. He served in that Peloponnesian War when the Athenians and their allies were defeated by the Spartans, other Greeks, and their allies. He was involved in some political controversies that arose in the wake of Athens' defeat in the war and the installation of some tyrants by Athens. Athens eventually reestablished its democracy. So Socrates, late in his life, starts running around the city. He's certainly pretty poor for an inhabitant of Athens, and he's talking to anyone, anywhere about virtue, and he asks them about their views. He doesn't charge them for discussion, unlike other philosophers. He's very popular with the youth, but he's not popular with the establishment. And so why is there no heading Socrates in our text? Well, because Socrates didn't write anything down, unlike lots of other philosophers. We don't have any writing of his because he didn't write. What we do have are accounts of Socrates from his contemporaries, a bunch of Athenians, and then his star student Plato. And Plato wrote only dialogues. He didn't write essays. So all of Plato's sort of philosophical writing involves conversations between different characters. And Socrates is one of the most prominent characters in many of Plato's dialogues. He's a central character. In some of the later dialogues, which we'll be reading, it looks like Socrates is being used to put forward Plato's own views. But in the first dialogue, in the Euthyphro and in some other dialogues, it looks like the Socrates character is more a representation of maybe how Socrates was, or at least an idealized version of Socrates. Plato very clearly, when we read the dialogues, really put Socrates up on a pedestal and really idolized him. And so we can't be confident that all of the representations of how Socrates is in the dialogues written by Plato are how Socrates really was, but there is this Socrates character in the dialogues. And in particular, the dialogues we need to understand are not actually historical records of actual dialogues. Similar things may have happened, probably did happen, but they're not actually records. They are all basically fictions. Well, so when we turn to the Euthyphro, what we're reading is then a dialogue written by Plato where Socrates is the sort of the hero or the main protagonist in some sense of the dialogue, and we're reading in what's sort of an idealized version, at least as Plato thinks of it, of his teacher, Socrates. So what's going on in the dialogue? Well, it's called the Euthyphro. That's because there was a real person, a real Athenian Euthyphro. That's not fiction. And Plato has them bump into each other outside of a court in Athens. And Euthyphro and Socrates start talking. Socrates says, "Oh, I'm here because I've been accused. I've been accused of setting up false gods in place of the true gods and of corrupting the youth. There are people who don't like the way that Socrates is running around inquiring about virtue and impressing the youth, and so someone has accused him of violating various laws of Athens, and so he's there as part of his defense." It turns out that Euthyphro was kind of a sort of a New Age character, like New Age religion for Athens at that time, and so he's sort of has lots of his own ideas about the gods. And Euthyphro is there not because he's been accused of anything, but because he's brought a suit against his father. He is accusing his father of murder. And Socrates is really shocked by this, learning this, because that's what appeared to be a violation of a really fundamental ethical obligation in standard Athenian ethics, the way Athenians think about what you should do and what you shouldn't do, which is that you need to be loyal to your family, and in particular to your parents, and probably in particular to your father. And Euthyphro is completely violating that obligation. And so at first Socrates is like, "Really? Wow, that's like, and are you sure?" And that's a good idea. And Euthyphro says, yes, it absolutely is. And he tells a story about why he thinks his father is guilty of murder. And Socrates says, wow, well, if you're doing this, you must really know what piety is. And if you're violating this family code. Piety is a funny word. It's a word that we don't use so much anymore. It roughly means, and we'll see that there's a question about what piety really is. That's what the dialogue is about. Roughly, it means what the gods love, or what the gods approve of. We could think of it now as maybe if we believe in Christianity or Islam or Judaism, it would be what the God of that religion loves most, or what is most pleasing to that God. We might broadly think of it as what is the ethically, or in terms of what's good and bad, what is the most important thing, and that's what they're really discussing. And they're talking about it in terms of with their religion or their supernatural beliefs, which would be the gods. And so Socrates says, look, you'd really have to know what piety was if you were going to accuse your father of being of murder, because that's normally accusing your father of murder would be considered the absolutely most impious thing. And Euthyphro says, you're right, I would have to know, and I do. And so Socrates says, wow, you do? Well, then I want to be your student because I need to know what piety is so that I can defend myself from these charges of setting up the wrong gods. It would be really good if I knew what piety was. And Euthyphro says, no problem, I will tell you. And so we need to find out. Is Euthyphro a good teacher? Is Socrates a good student? And does Socrates find out what piety is, or does he find out anything else? And that is what we will get to in the next video.